But I just shortly introduced you, mainly
Yeah.
with the emphasis that we respect and revere you very much for your deep
Mm,
trust in the Buddha and his teaching, but
mm,
also for your social engagement. I shortly explained the founding of Buddhist Global Relief in 2008, and that we followed this example with starting with Mitgefühl in Aktion e.V. in Germany, and that you are our patron and so on,
mm,
as you usually hear from me.
mm.
And this evening, now I keep on in English, you have the translation down. Bante will talk about the Hemavata Sutta, a very inspiring story and verses from the Suttanipāta, which he translated as a whole, the whole Suttanipāta, along with its commentaries. And now I would like to ask Bante to speak the Namo Tassa for us and with us.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa.
Thank you. Thank you. So it's my honor, Bante, to, after having introduced you already, to turn over the microphone to you and welcome you very much
Mm,
to this audience. Thank you for joining. Thank you for taking time.
mm,
And
mm.
it's the microphone is on your side now.
Okay, it's for me now?
Yes, Bante.
Oh, okay. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to give the talk uh, today, long distance. And thank you for organizing also this contribution to help the people of Sri Lanka. Yeah, we've also gotten appeals from Sri Lanka, so Buddhist Global Relief has also provided assistance
Hmm.
to some organizations in Sri Lanka. And also we received recently, just a few days ago, a request from an organization in South India that BGR has supported over the years. They've also been affected by the same cyclone. Okay, so I'm going to, as you mentioned, I will be basing my talk on a sutta that occurs in the Samyutta Nikaya called the Hemavata Sutta. And the sutta takes the form of initially a dialogue between two yakas, or in Sanskrit, yakshas. So what are yakshas? Okay, the yaksha is a in Indian mythology, it's a kind of demonic being who have a double character. On the one hand, the yakas are depicted as fierce, ferocious beings who can be highly destructive. It's in some of these suttas, they're shown to be very ferocious. They capture human beings. They devour their flesh, discard their bones. So they can be very terrifying. And the figure of the yaksha continues down into South Asian culture. So in a country like Sri Lanka, there's a common belief that dark forests are haunted by yakshas, and people are afraid to go into the forests or to go to dark places, isolated, deserted places, from fear that they will be grabbed and maybe devoured by the yakshas or harmed by the yakshas. But the yakas also have another nature, that they're very intelligent, and they have the capacity to understand the Dharma and even to attain stages of realization, at least the stages of stream entry, perhaps even once returning. So in the general Buddhist cosmology, the yakas are placed in the Deva world, though not quite dwelling in a heavenly realm, but they come in the lowest of the six desire realm heavenly worlds, called the heaven of the four great kings. And I think that they're assigned to the northern region of that heaven under the control of a deity called Vaisavana. But the yakas also have a very close relationship to our earthly world, to our earth. So though they're assigned to the Deva world, but they're seen to hover, to dwell close to the earth, and they have the ability to interact with human beings. And so the Hemavata Sutta begins as a dialogue between two yakas, two of these demonic beings. And we could see, you could look at the sutta from two different points of view. If you take a very sort of traditional point of view, you would see the sutta as a record of actual fact, a record of a conversation that has actually taken place. But if you look at it maybe from a standpoint of sort of modern critical scholarship, you could see the sutta as a literary composition which has the purpose of extolling the virtues of the Buddha and then leading into a discussion of very profound, I would say, some of the deepest aspects of the Dhamma. I would myself inclined to take it in the second way, to see this as a literary composition by the compilers of the Pali Canon, who wanted to promulgate the Buddha's teaching by showing that and to praise and extol the Buddha by showing that beings from some other realm of existence also praise and extol the Buddha. There's a background story to the sutta which comes in the commentary. And again, you can either accept the commentarial story regarding it as fiction or accept it as having some authority. According to the commentarial story, in a previous life, the two yakas that we meet in the sutta had been monks during the time of the previous Buddha, Kassapa. But in the time of Kassapa Buddha, these two monks in some way compromised the purity of the Dhamma. And because of that, they didn't create such heavy bad karma that would lead to a rebirth in lower realms. And so they were dedicated, they had been dedicated, earnest monks, but just through some little bias, a little sort of appeal to their greed, they compromised the purity of the Dharma. And because of that, they were reborn in the yaka realms. And so we meet these two yakas, and I'm going to share the screen to go through the dialogue. So we go through it together. Is it visible to you? Okay.
It's visible.
Okay, so again, now continuing with the story, these two yakas, They had been friends in the previous life. They had been monks living together. They were friends. They committed this unwholesome deed. And so they were reborn in the yucca world, but they were still, as yuccas, they were friends. And they had made an agreement with each other that if any of them saw some wondrous sight, something wonderful, magnificent, something astonishing, they would go to report this sight to the other. And so at the beginning of the sutta now, Sutta has seen an auspicious sight coming up from the area around Benares. You see, Hemavata is living in the Himalayan mountains, and Sattagira is living in Middle India, in the plains. And Sattagira, at the time the Buddha has started to teach the Dhamma, Sattagira has seen the magnificent light arise in the world, coming out from the Buddha's Dhamma teaching. And Sattagira has gone to see the Buddha. He's heard some discourses of the Buddha, and now he wants to convey the message to his friend, Hemavata, that a Buddha, a fully enlightened one, has appeared in the world, and he wants to bring him to meet the Buddha. And so they're meeting on the 15th day of the fortnight. This is the Uposatha day. It's the full moon night. And so Sattagira says that it's now the 15th of the fortnight. It's a celestial night. And if you've ever been in either Sri Lanka, where I've been, or India, the tropical country, on a full moon night, sometimes the moonlight is just so bright and it floods the countryside. It seems almost as if it's daytime. So the moonlight is just flooding over the plain. And so Sattagira has come to Hemavata and he's asking him, come, let us go see Gautama. And he calls him the teacher of perfect name. Anoma namang satarang. Let us go see Gautama, referring to him by clan name. But Hemavata is a little bit skeptical, or at least a little bit inquisitive. And so he's going to ask about the qualities of this teacher, Gautama. And as we'll see, it seems to me that the questions that Hemavata will be asking are going to bring out from Sattagira the conformity of the Buddha's conduct to the 10 courses of wholesome karma. And so there's a kind of template laid over this first part of the sutta in which the 10 courses of wholesome karma are used as a means for bringing out and exposing, revealing the virtues or qualities of the Buddha. Though there will be some little revisions made in those 10 courses of wholesome action. And so first Hemavata asks whether the mind of, he calls him Tadino, which is what I translate here as the impartial one, whether he is well disposed towards all beings, whether he's mastered his thoughts towards those who are agreeable and disagreeable. And so it seems to me that this question is sort of pointing towards the first course of wholesome karma, refraining from harming living beings, from inflicting bodily harm or killing living beings. And then Sattagira confirms that indeed the mind of the impartial one is well disposed towards all beings, that he's mastered his thoughts towards those who are agreeable and disagreeable. Okay, then comes the second question, whether he avoids taking what has not been given, whether he doesn't steal, and the answer is that he doesn't steal. And then the third question is whether he is self-controlled in regard to living beings. I think we have this three questions here, which I think, as I see it, are pointing to the Buddha's observance of brahmacharya, of celibacy. So by self-control means, does he control his desires, his sensual desires in regard to living beings? And especially what underscores this, that he is not devoid of jhana. So he abstains from sensuality. He's devoted to heedfulness, appamada, and he engages in jhana, the meditative absorptions, which is connected with refraining from sexual activity. The next verse runs through the four courses of wholesome speech. So I just take the answers that he doesn't speak falsely. His way of speaking is not rough. That is, he doesn't utter harsh speech. What he says is not destructive. He doesn't utter speech which creates divisions between people, which creates conflict, disharmony between people. But his speech is always intended to promote harmony and union between people. And then the fourth is that he abstains from idle chatter, because what he speaks is meaningful. It always adheres to atta, to what is rich in value and in meaning. Okay, then the next verse, the way I say it, is pointing to, so we have the first verses are referring somewhat obliquely to the three wholesome courses of action pertaining to bodily conduct: abstaining from killing or physically harming others, abstaining from stealing, and in this case, abstaining from sexual activity. The next verse refers to the four courses of wholesome action with respect to speech. And then the next verse is referring to the three courses of wholesome action pertaining to the mind. And so he asks whether he is free from lust for sensual pleasures, but we'll just take the answers. So Sattagira says he has no lust for sensual pleasures. So this is indicating the virtue of anabhijja, being free from craving or greed. His mind is unsullied, so this implies the absence of anger, hatred, or ill will. And then the usual third course of wholesome action is holding right view. But in this case, with reference to the Buddha, it's not sufficient to say that he has right view. And so the question goes to a deeper level and asks whether the Buddha has overcome delusion and whether he has Dhammesu. Let me see how it goes in Pali. Dhammesu Chakuma, whether he has the vision of Dhammas, the eye of wisdom that sees into the real nature of things. And so Satagira replies that he has no lust for sensual pleasures. He's free of sensual craving. His mind is not sullied by ill will, anger, or hatred. He's overcome all delusion, and he has the eye wisdom that sees into the nature of dharmas. And then the next question now is continuing further. And again, I'll just take the answers. So Satyagira explains that he's endowed with clear knowledge. And the key word here, this is vijja, and he's pure in conduct. So this is indicating charita. And then next he says that all of his asavas have been destroyed, which indicates that the Buddha has attained the Nibbana element with residue remaining, that he's experiencing Nibbana, Nirvana in this life itself, and that he has no renewed existence, no further wandering in samsara, which indicates that he's attained or will attain the Nibbana element without residue remaining. And so now Satyagira has convinced Hemavata of the virtuous qualities of the Buddha. And so now Hemavata indicates his willingness to go see the Buddha. And so together they say, come, let's go see Gautama, the one who's accomplished in clear knowledge and conduct. This is that quality mentioned over and over in the suttas, vijja charana sampanno. And so now they're going to see the Buddha. They praise him in other ways as one with antelope calves, slender, the hero, greedless. He's like a lion wandering alone. And then comes in this verse the key topic about which they are going to ask him. And so this sort of brings us to the core of the message of the sutta. They're going to ask him about release from the snare of death. And so it shows that even though the sutta begins with relation, dealing with these ethical aspects of the Dhamma, but the key point that they're homing in on is how does one gain release from this cycle of repeated birth and death in which all sentient beings are trapped? And so now they agree. So now they're coming closer and closer to the Buddha. And so now they arrive in the presence of the Buddha and they say to each other, let us ask Gautama, the expounder, the instructor, and then beautiful line, the one who has gone beyond all dhammas, all phenomena. Yes, sabadhamang paragung. Yeah, the word para here usually means like the far shore of a body of water, the far shore of a sea, of an ocean, and sabba dhammang are all conditioned phenomena. And so the Buddha is praised as one who has gone to the far shore beyond all the conditioned phenomena of this world, and the one who has overcome all enmity and peril. Okay, so now they finish their praise of the Buddha. They've come to his presence, and now they're going to ask their questions. Let's move this all onto the same page. Okay, so now the questions are very, very concise. They almost take the form of riddles, and the Buddha's answers are also somewhat cryptic and enigmatic. And so to understand them, we have to bring in a number of other suttas from other places in the Pali Canon. So first, let us look at the questions, the riddles, and the Buddha's answers. So they ask the question, in what has the world arisen? In what or in relation to what does it form intimacy? What does the world cling to? And how is the world afflicted? In what is the world afflicted? And then the Buddha replies, he says, in 6, the world has arisen. It forms intimacy, bonds, attachments in regard to 6 things. By clinging to 6 things, the world is afflicted in regard to 6. So if we just look at the questions and the answers by themselves, they seem utterly baffling, almost incomprehensible. But to understand them, we have to bring in a number of other suttas which sort of explain in greater detail the meaning behind these short answers that the Buddha gives here. And so one sutta that helps us to understand the meaning of these riddles comes in the Samyutta Nikaya, in the Nidana Samyutta, chapter 12. It's sutta number 44, where the Buddha says, addressing the monks, he says, I will teach you the origin and passing away of the world. And so this is elaborating that answer that the Buddha gives here very concisely. In 6, the world has arisen. And so in the sutta, in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha, he raises the question, what is the origin of the world? How does the world arise? Okay, now when we look at the world objectively, we think we can find some causal explanation for the origin of the world. If we take the standpoint of the physical sciences, maybe we try to explain the world originating through the Big Bang, and another theory holds that the Big Bang was not the starting point, but before the Big Bang, there was a big crunch from another cosmos collapsed upon itself that led to the concentration of matter and energy into a single point, which then exploded in the Big Bang. And after this world and universe in which we presently find ourselves will eventually collapse upon itself, into another big crunch, followed by another big bang. And so from that standpoint of the physical sciences, we have a beginningless cycle of physical universes. Or if we take the theistic standpoint, the standpoint of theistic religions, the quest for the origin of the world takes us to a almighty or powerful creator God who creates the world out of nothing and then rules the world in accordance with his will. But the Buddha gives a different explanation of the origin of the world, which grounds the origin of the world in our own immediate experience. So here he says, what is the origin of the world? And he starts by directing us to immediate experience, independence on the I and visible forms. I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. And this is going to be said, the same principle with regard to the other sense modalities. Independence on the ear and sounds, independence on the nose and odors, independence on the tongue and tastes, independence on the body and textures, independence on the mind and mental objects. Consciousness arises. So that gives the answer to the 6 things which the world has arisen. The world arises through 6 internal sense bases from the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind faculty in their encounters with the 6 corresponding objects: visible forms, sounds, odors, tastes, textures, and mental objects. But then how does the origination take place? When the object impinges on the sense faculty, consciousness arises, and the meeting of the 3 is contact. Then through contact as condition, a feeling arises, and especially the pleasant feeling forms the condition for craving. Craving is the condition for clinging. In dependence on clinging, we engage in various activities which constitute the causes for renewed existence. And then through our accumulation of karmic potentialities, there occurs birth. And so the world arises anew at birth, followed by old age, sickness and death, sorrow, weeping, pain, dejection, and despair. So that is the arising of the world, according to the Buddha's teaching. And so when you want to find the origin of the world, so it's not a matter of sort of traveling back in time, because as far back in time as we go, we're always going to come upon ourselves in previous lives endowed with the 6 sense faculties, encountering objects, and consciousness arises, and through the encounter generating craving, clinging, karmic formations, bringing about new birth, old age, and death. And so the origin of the world lies within ourself through the arising of craving in regard to the objects of the senses. And it's through that craving, again in the 6 sense bases, that the world forms intimacy. And then it's through forming that intimacy with the world, that is the craving that binds us to the objects of the senses. Through that craving, the clinging takes place. And then through the clinging, we become afflicted through birth, old age, sickness, and death, afflicted in the six sense bases. Okay, then in the next verse, Hemavata asks the Buddha, what is that clinging, like say, by which the world is afflicted? And then he asks, tell me about the outlet, the escape, release. How is one released from suffering, from dukkha? And it seems that even though the question is phrased by way of upadana, clinging, but I think what the answer seems to be pointing to is not the subjective clinging, but the objects that are the basis of clinging. And so the answer says that there are these 5 objects of sensual pleasure, and mind is declared to be the 6th. And these 2 lines, a little bit, they mix up 2 different categories. So the first line points to the objects of sensory experience. And so it mentions the 5 strands of sensual pleasure. So these will be delightful, visible forms, sounds, odors, tastes, and tactile objects. And that will imply the 6th object, which are the dhammas, the mind objects, the purely mental objects. The second line mentions the mind as the 6th, but the mind is not the 6th object of sensual, but the mind is the 6th sense faculty. So when mind is said to be the 6th, this will imply the 5 physical sense bases that go along with mind. So that is the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. So here we have together the 6 sense objects and the 6 sense faculties. So together, the 6 sense objects, six sense faculties, those are the bases of clinging, the things to which we adhere through our clinging. And so the next question asks about the outlet, the escape, or the release. So he's asking, how is one released from suffering? And the answer comes, having expunged desire for these, having ended craving for these, one is thereby released from dukkha, from suffering. And then if we go back to that sutta that I referred to earlier in the Samyutta Nikaya, this is chapter 12, sutta number 44, where the Buddha says, I will teach you the origin and the cessation of the world. So we already went through the origin of the world, and now we come, what is the passing away of the world, or the cessation of the world, the ending of the world? And so this is going to be an elaboration of the point made in this verse, number 171. The Buddha says, again, he starts in the same way, in dependence on the eye and visible forms, eye consciousness arises. In dependence on the ear and sounds, ear consciousness arises. Again, in dependence on the nose and odors and dependence on the tongue and taste, and dependence on the body and textures, and dependence on the mind, mental objects, mind consciousness arises. So consciousness arises through the impingement of object on sense faculty. The meeting of the three is contact. Through contact, feeling arises. With feeling as condition, there is craving. And so when we yield to that craving, that becomes the source of bondage to the world. And the outlet, the way to release, this is what is indicated next in the sutta. The sutta says, with the complete fading away and cessation of craving, there is cessation of clinging. With cessation of clinging, there's the end to karmic accumulations. With the end of karmic accumulations, there's the end of birth. With the end of birth, the end of old age and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, and despair. That is the liberation from the world, the passing away or cessation of the world. Yeah, in this connection, there's another sutta which is rather interesting, which almost dwells on the same point from a different angle. And this is a sutta that occurs in the Samyutta Nikaya. It's in the Deva Putta Samyutta. So there's a young Deva by the name of Rohitassa who comes to the Buddha and says, is it possible to reach the end of the world by traveling, to reach that point where one is no longer subject to birth, old age, and death? And the Buddha says, as for that end of the world where one is no longer subject to birth, old age, and death, where one is no longer subject to suffering, that cannot be reached by traveling. For no matter where we travel, now we're developing rocket ships to go to other planets in our solar system. Maybe at some later time in the future, we're going to develop kind of devices by which we can go through wormholes to other galaxies. We go to the farthest point of the Milky Way, the farthest point of the known universe. But wherever we go, we're going to be bringing our sense faculties with us. And so we're never going to be reaching the end of the world by traveling. And so the Buddha says it's not possible to reach the end of the world by traveling. And then when the Buddha says this, then this Deva, Rohitassa, says that this is wonderful, this is amazing. He says that in the past, I had this supernormal power so that I could travel with the speed of light. And I traveled day after day, never pausing for hundreds of years, thousands of years, stopping only to eat and to sleep. And yet I never reached the end of the world. And then the Buddha says, you can never reach the end of the world by traveling, but without having reached the end of the world, there is no putting an end to dukkha, to suffering. And then the Buddha says, it is in this fathom-high body, endowed with perception and thought, that I declare the world, the origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the way leading to the cessation of the world. And so the cessation of the world or liberation from the world, well, first, the origin of the world, that occurs in this fathom-long body through our craving and clinging that arise and flow out through the six sense bases. And then the liberation from the world, the cessation of the world, comes by the controlling, the restraint of craving through the six sense bases and the elimination of clinging through the six sense bases. And so, as the verse says in the Hemavata Sutta, having expunged desire or craving for the six sense objects and the six sense faculties, one is thereby released from dukkha, from suffering. Okay, so with this, we could say that in the Buddha's response to the first questions of Hemavata, this would be the answer in verse 169. The Buddha has touched on the first noble truth, the noble truth of dukkha, where dukkha, the truth of suffering, is expounded by way of the six sense bases, the six sense faculties, and the six sense objects to which we cling. And the truth of the origin of suffering is indicated by the intimacy or the craving that one forms through the six sense bases. So these verses deal with the truth of dukkha and the truth of its origin. And verse number 171, having expunged desire for these, this indicates the truth of the cessation of dukkha. That is through the ending of craving that one is released from suffering. But now, the yaka, or the Hemavata, is going to ask, indirectly referring to the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path. So he asks, who here crosses the flood? Who crosses this vast sea? Who does not sink in the deep, which is without foothold, without support? And so what's meant here by the flood, this would be the flood of samsara, the cycle of repeated birth and death. Also, the samsara is also the referent of the term the vast sea. So all of us living beings, we are all sort of immersed in this flood or sea of repeated birth and death, going from birth through our life, growth, development, old age, sickness, and death, followed by new birth, old age, sickness, and death. So again and again, we sink in the deep. And this depth of samsara is said to be without foothold, without support. Yes, very, very significant, those lines. And the way I understand them, without foothold, so there's no way to get any security within the samsara through material means. So we accumulate maybe wealth, high position, fame, power, but that is not a foothold that's going to sustain us. Even with all of the wealth, power, position that we have, we still are sinking in the deep. Without support, with nothing to hold on to, we sort of grasp for things to hold on to, but there's nothing to hold on to. So how does one cross the flood? How does one cross the sea? How does one escape from this deep ocean of repeated birth and death. And then the Buddha answers in verse 174, he says, one always accomplished in good behavior. I want to get the Pali for this. Yeah, first I'll read the Pali. Sabuddha sila sampanno panyava susamahito ajata chinti satima ogang tarati dutarang. So one who is always accomplished in sila, in good behavior, then panyava, one who possesses panya or wisdom, susamahito, well concentrated. So there we have the three trainings which are put out of the normal sequence, probably, certainly for metrical reasons. So here we have sila, samadhi, and panya, the threefold training, and then they're reinforced by two other terms. Ajata chinti, which is translated inwardly reflective, and the commentary connects this with wisdom, and then satima, mindful, which the commentary connects with samadhi, with concentration, because mindfulness is the base for developing concentration. So here we have the threefold training as the means for crossing the flood so hard to cross. And what I found interesting is that we can connect, usually we have sort of fixed, elaborate ways of explaining the threefold training of sila, samadhi, and wisdom, but there are ways to connect the threefold training with the six sense bases. So one of the aspects of the training in sila, apart from observing the precepts, is guarding the doors of the sense faculties. And so we have a fixed formula for this in regard to the monastic training. So one sees a visible form with the eye, one does not grasp upon the form, looking for examining the form and its details, hearing a sound with the ear, smelling an odor, tasting flavors with the tongue, feeling textures with the body, cognizing ideas with the mind. One doesn't grasp upon its features, because when one grasps upon the features of the object, then states of craving and aversion arise and overwhelm the mind and push one towards unwholesome courses of behavior. And so we have restraint of the sense faculties starts as an ethical practice. And so it comes under sila, or good behavior. But then restraint of the sense faculties serves also as a basis for samadhi. So in developing samadhi, one withdraws the mind from the outer physical senses and focuses the mind inwardly upon a particular meditation object. So it could be, for example, usually we start with the mindfulness of breathing, focusing upon the breath. So one is not allowing the mind to run out to grasp upon visible forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, but one draws the mind internally. Or one could focus upon a kasina, a colored disc, or any other kind of object for developing calmness or samadhi. And in this way, one is drawing the mind away from the physical from the material sense objects and focusing the mind inwardly. So that is towards the task of developing samadhi. And then in the practice of satipatthana, we have mindfulness directed. One of the exercises in contemplation of Dhammas is the contemplation of the 6 sense bases. So the text says that the practitioner understands the eye and visible forms and the fetter that arises in dependence on both, understands the ear and sounds, the nose and odors and so forth. So in developing the 4 foundations of mindfulness, one practices contemplation of the sense bases. And then in the development of wisdom, we find some suttas explained that to practice wisdom means that one understands as they really are the origin and passing away, the gratification, danger, and escape in regard to the 6 bases for contact. And then there's a sutta where a monk comes to the Buddha and says, I'm lost. I don't understand as they really are the origin and passing away, gratification, danger, and escape in regard to the 6 sense bases. And then the Buddha doesn't elaborate upon this in detail, but he says, contemplate the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind thus. This is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. And then the Buddha says, when you clearly see this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, that itself is the cessation of dukkha, the end of suffering. And so here we could say that we could relate sila, samadhi, and panya to the 6 sense bases. The culmination is the practice of wisdom by contemplating the 6 sense bases through that lens of not mine, not I, not myself. And then the Buddha says, one who fulfills that 3-fold training crosses the flood of samsara, the round of birth and death, which is so hard to cross. And then the poem ends with 2 beautiful verses, which I like to recite first in Pali. I have to find the Pali version. Was now the 2 yakshas are now convinced about the enlightenment of the Buddha. They've now accepted the Buddha as their teacher. And so they praise him in very, very beautiful verses. Okay, so verse 176. Gambhira panyang nipunata dasing akinchinang kama bhave satang tang pasata sabadi vipamutang tibe pate kama manang mahesing. So they say, behold him of Gambhira Panya, deep wisdom, the one who sees the subtle meaning. And then he calls the Buddha a kinchinang, which is translated inadequately here, owning nothing, but it really means, in a sense, one who has become nothing, who has no identity anymore, freed from all sense of clinging to things as mine or taking anything to be I or self, unattached to sensual pleasures and to the round of repeated existence. He's everywhere released, freed entirely from everything. And he calls him Mahesi, the great Rishi, walking the Diba Patang, the divine path. And then the commentary explains the divine path here as being the path of the jhanas and the brahmaviharas. But then the next verse completes this with some alteration in the lines. It starts off in almost in a similar way. It says, Anomanamang nipunata dasing panyadadang kamalaye asatang tang pasata sabha vidung sumedang arye pate kama manang mahesing. Behold him of perfect name, the one who sees the subtle meaning. Now he's the giver of wisdom, unattached to the lair or the trap of sensual pleasures. He's Sabhavidu, all-knowing, Sumeda, very wise. And now he's the great Rishi treading the Arya Pata, the noble path, not the divine path. Of course, he treads also the divine path, the path of the jhanas and the brahmaviharas, but he's one who has walked the noble path, the liberating path, the path to the liberation from birth and death. And then finally, the two yakshas together say that today we've seen a great, wonderful sight. We've seen the Buddha, the enlightened one, the one who has crossed the flood. And then they each have their entourage, their retinues of 500. Each one has 500 yakas in their retinues. And they say that all of us, we go to you for refuge. You are our supreme teacher. And then they say we will wander from village to village, from mountain to mountain, paying homage to you, the enlightened one, and to the excellence of the Dhamma. Okay, and with that, I will end my exposition of the Hemavata Sutta. So yeah, I left some time, so maybe if there's any questions, then.
First of all, let us thank you, Bhante, by saying the three times the sadhu, sadhu, sadhu together. Sadhu, 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 anumodanam. Thank you, Bhante, for this reflection on the Hemavata Sutta. And as you mentioned, maybe there are some questions or comments on it, so please feel free. Wenn jemand in Deutsch etwas anmerken oder fragen möchte, können wir das gerne besetzen.
I guess somebody asked a question in German. I will see the subtitles in English.
Yeah. So, given the fact that I'm the host, I can maybe put the first question.
Yeah.
Bhante, what would you say? These yakas have quite understood a lot of Dhamma before they even met the Buddha. And then they were soon very deeply convinced and what do you think is the background? It's difficult to imagine that these are strange wild demons, right? What is your
Yeah,
take?
well, according to again, if we take the commentary says that in a previous life they had been monks under the during the time of the Buddha, the Kassapa Buddha. But again, I would look at the sutta as being a literary composition rather than taking it as being a record of historical fact.
Very good. Mm.
Yeah. What's interesting, though, is that in the Suttanipāta, there are two other suttas in which yakas play a prominent role. And in those two suttas, also the yakas ask the Buddha questions in the form of riddles.
Mm.
And when they ask the questions, they threaten the Buddha. They say, I'm going to ask you these questions. If you can't answer the questions, I'm going to grab you by the feet and
Oh,
throw you across the Ganges River, or I'm going to split your heart open or drive you insane. Yeah, so those are the yakshas, the more violent type of yakshas. And then the Buddha answers, he says, I do not see anybody in this world who can grab me by my feet and throw me across the Ganges River. But if you want, ask your questions. And then they ask the questions. And then the Buddha answers to their satisfaction. And then they become delighted. And then they declare themselves as followers of the Buddha. Yeah, one is the Alavaka Sutta, the other is the Suchi Loma Sutta. And interestingly, also, I found in the Indian classic, the Mahabharata, also we find that yakshas pose riddles to the human being. So it seems in Indian religion, that seems to be one of the functions of the yakshas, is to sort of corner human beings and to ask them riddles. And when the human being can't answer the riddle, then the yaksha will destroy them, kill them in some form. But of course, the Buddha can't be vanquished by any of the yakshas, but instead he converts them.
There's a question from Rahul.
Yeah, I say it's a comment. He's referring what I've seen earlier. It's the Yaksha Prashna chapter. It's in the Mahabharata, where I think a yaksha poses questions to one of the heroes of the Mahabharata, Yudhishthira, I think his name is. I think it's like 100 riddles that he asks him. Yeah.
so my question was that these two yakshas, they were monks in the previous life, which means they were in contact with the Dharma. So, is it possible for someone to regress to such an extent that in another life they need to be reminded of the Dharma to go back to it? Thank you in advance.
I think that applies to us human beings as well. Like maybe we had, probably all of us, maybe many of us, contact with the Dhamma in previous life, and then we come into this life. Like I'm born in Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in the city, don't have any knowledge about Buddhism. Then later, by chance, I meet in my case, I met a Vietnamese Buddhist monk in graduate school, and that sort of reminded me of the Dhamma. And so for most of us, I think it works in that way. So we could have had connections with the Dhamma from previous life. When we come into this life, if we're not born in a Buddhist family or Buddhist culture, we grow up with different beliefs or no beliefs at all. And then at some later point in our life, then we encounter somebody who will introduce us to the Dhamma, and that reminds us of the connection.
Yeah, thank you. But that's redeeming that if we are in contact with Dhamma, we never, probably at least we can hope that we would never fall away from it to such an extent that it's irreversible.
That what? Oh, irreversible.
Yes,
Yeah, I think
yes.
that's the importance. That's the value of having that determination of going for refuge to the three jewels. So that is that sense of saranagamanam, going for refuge, that forms the connecting link that binds us to the Buddha's teaching in life after life. So even if we fall away from the human realm, like into the realm of the yakshas, but if we have that strong sense of going for refuge, that sense of refuge will connect us in some way, hopefully, to the Buddha's teaching again and again.
Bante, can you read Luke's question in the chat?
Oh, I see. I'm curious by the notion that some of these yakshas are benevolent or malicious, despite their high realm affiliation. Please explain why that is. Yeah, I don't know. It's just that's the way yakshas are depicted in the text. It could be that the idea of the violent and destructive yakshas might have come from a much more ancient layer of Indian culture, where there was the belief in these demonic, destructive beings. And then they were sort of absorbed into Buddhism. And then in the Buddha's cosmology, the Buddha's cosmology had to find a place for them. And so they assigned them, as I said earlier, to the lowest level of the six sense sphere deva worlds, desire realm deva worlds. And so then the yakshas become a kind of being existing in the deva realm, though they're not they're not shown as existing in the heavenly realm. And so they have that capacity for understanding and penetrating the Dhamma. And so some of them then become capable of conversion to the Buddha's teaching.
Chaya is the next. Please, Chaya, go ahead and unmute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bante, for the teaching. But Bante, I have a question. You talked about the yakas and also the devas communicating with humans sometimes, and this seemed to have happened a lot in the Buddha's time. Do you think that it happens now, or not? I'm curious to know your opinion about that. Thank you very much.
I think that there are people who have that was it called? It's not clairvoyant, but they have this ability. There are some people who could serve as mediums who have the ability to communicate with the devas and with beings in other realms of existence. Yeah, so there are people who have that ability, but I mean, it's not so common.
Thank you, Bante.
Now it would be John.
Hi, and thank you again, Bante, for your teaching. I'm curious because you mentioned this particular bit of writing, the Hemavata Sutta, is essentially a literary form. And of course, so that would mean it was devised in such a way, or poetic way, to teach, I think.
Yeah.
Do the yakas appear in other forms, like a typical sutta, or is always kind of a literary device? Is that clear?
No, I don't understand.
So in this particular literary piece,
yeah,
yakas appear, and they have a function. They go to Buddha. But when I think of suttas, I don't necessarily think that they're all the discourses are literary devices. They are formulaic and they follow a pattern, but their lessons are more pragmatic in some sense than poetry.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm asking if the yakas appear in those types of suttas outside of a poetic form in terms of being presented to us.
I think always wherever the yakas appear, the sutta has a pedagogical purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a chapter in the first book of the Samyutta Nikaya. It's called the Yaka Samyutta. So that's a collection of about, I think it's 12 suttas in mixed prose and verse in which yakas play prominent roles.
And around Alavi, isn't it? There isn't it even that a yaka became a monk?
No, a yaka can't become a monk because to become a monk you have to be a human being.
Mm.
But around Alavi, there's the Alavaka Sutta.
Mm.
Yeah, so that is a yaka that's one of the yakas who threatens the Buddha that he's going to grab him by the feet and throw him across the Ganges River. And then the Buddha answers the riddles, and then Alavaka is pleased with the Buddha and then declares that he's now a follower of the Buddha, and he's going to travel around proclaiming the excellence of the Dhamma. But as a yaka, he can't become a monk.
Sung-Yun Lee, would you like to put your question?
Thank you. I'm in a Zen tradition practicing.
Yeah.
So I heard the basic concept or basic structure of Heart Sutra, what you were teaching this evening. So it's very interesting. My English is not very perfect, but I will try.
It's quite good.
Yeah. So sometimes I ask myself if I really liberated, or we human beings liberated from these 6 senses or 6 realms of senses. So we are liberated from the cycle of life and death. So there will be no human being in this earth.
There'll always be human beings on this earth, as long as the earth exists. Yeah. There might not be human beings on this earth, not if we get liberated from birth and death, but if we continue to develop spread nuclear weapons, in that case, there might not be human beings on this earth. Or if we continue to burn fossil fuels to the point that we completely destabilize the climate that's conducive to human life on this planet.
So this planet, our Earth, cannot be really liberated and enlightened, the whole human beings?
No,
it's not possible?
I think as long as human civilization exists, yeah, the beings who gain liberation will always be very, very small proportion of the totality of human beings. The vast majority will always be overcome, driven by the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, delusion. That's inevitable.
Is that why the Mahayana Buddhists created the concept of bodhisattva?
Well, the bodhisattva is one who forms the aspiration or vow to attain Buddhahood and then makes the vow to remain in samsara in order to teach and liberate other living beings until they acquire all of the merits and virtues to attain Buddhahood. But eventually the bodhisattva attains Buddhahood, and there'll always still be sentient beings who have to be instructed and liberated.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I
Okay.
think I'm going to have to
Thank you.
end the session now because I have to go to I have to travel to Boston this afternoon for some function. So usually when I end the session, I do a sharing of the merits. Well, should I do it that way?
Please.
Okay. So we do the sharing of the merits with, usually we do it to the Devas and Nagas, so we could also share the merits with the Yakshas. Okay. So I'll recite this as a traditional verse in Pali, known in all of the Theravadan countries. Akasata cha bhumata deva naga mahidika panyanta manumodipa chirangra kantu sasanang. Akasata cha bhumata deva naga mahidika panyanta manumodipa chirangra kantu desanang. Akasata cha bhumata deva naga mahidika panyanta manumoditva chirangra kantu mang parang dukha patachani dukha baya patachani baya soka patachani soka hantu sabe pipanino. May those in suffering be free from suffering. May those in fear be free from fear. May those in sorrow be free from sorrow. May all living beings also be thus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu,
Thank you,
sadhu,
Bhante. Thank you,
sadhu.
everybody.
I've
Bow
got
to Bhante.
heads.
Thank you, Bhante.
Okay, so thank you so much,
Sadhu, sadhu.
Raymond.
Have a safe trip to Boston, Bhante.
Okay, thank
Take
you.
care. We'll see
Thanks
you
for
next
Thank you,
joining
week.
us, Bhante.
Bhante.
Have
Okay,
a
thank
good
you so much,
Christmas
everyone.
time.
Bye.
Okay, Raimund.
Teruvan Sarnai, Namo Buddhaya.
Teruan
Okay,
Sarnai,
Thank you,
Bhante.
Bhante.
Tero
okay.
Ansaranai. Exactly. So, herzlichen Dank an jeden, der gekommen ist. Thanks for everyone who joined. May you be well.
Danke, Raimund.
Thank you for hosting this.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.